Good morning, everyone. It is a great, great pleasure to be here in this great museum. I want to thank Michelle Fricaro, the perfect Michelle Fricaro, not only for her introduction, but for conceptualizing and organizing this amazing conference. I'd like to thank the marvelous educators and curators of the National Gallery. I'd like to thank the technical genius, Mitch Bracken, who's helped not just me, but many of us the past 3 days. And I would like to thank all of you who have made it to the third day. I think it's wonderful that you're here and so energized still. I'm extremely grateful for this conference as we together build a new and wonderful international community for museum education. Our work in museum education is now global, thanks to the reach of the internet and the rise of social media. We think of MOOCs that reach thousands, online resources that serve millions, museum educators dedicated to a macro enterprise. In contrast, what Michelle just described, the practice of sitting quietly in a museum gallery with a single work of art, a museum educator, and a few like-minded art lovers is a micro experience, one that in the new global context may seem more like an endangered species than a program whose survival, I propose, is critical and whose function of reflective, attentive, close-looking, slow-looking, and deep-thinking conversation is irreplaceable in the modern world. Dialogue, that is, talking to and with about works of art, brings people together with works of art in ways that are meaningful and profound. Dialogue enables us to do so, to push the boundaries of what we see and understand, to travel beyond ourselves, to participate in the vast experiment of discovery and interpretation. For the museum educator, dialogue is the very foundation of interpretation. In the art museum, it begins with a long look and an open mind. It becomes a give and a take, a back and a forth. Dialogue is talking about a work of art with each other and with the work of art itself. A dialogical pedagogy encourages visitors to construct meaning through a seemingly simple idea. They will bring what they know. We, the museum educators, will bring what we know. And together, we will shape an interpretation. And yet, individually, paradoxically, we will come to our own understandings at the same time. Maxine Greene, the late, great philosopher at Columbia University Teachers College, sometimes known as the philosopher queen, and thinker about aesthetic education, would have added, all we need to do so are our lived lives. In the museum, dialogue cultivates knowledge, beauty, and inclusivity. A dialogical pedagogy is inherently informed, focused, inquisitive. A dialogical pedagogy fosters curiosity and creativity. A dialogical pedagogy includes information, but uses it carefully to follow, not direct, the thoughts of our participants. Through dialogue, we make possible acts of interpretation. Museum dialogues need to be transacted in a spirit of freedom in which we honor everyone's questions, what everyone brings to the artwork. When done well, we find that at the heart of every meaningful dialogical encounter with a work of art, there is a moment of truth. A mutual curiosity emerges. The museum educator is no longer visitor. The museum visitor is no longer spectator, but participant. The educator is no longer the driver of the experience, but part of it. The artwork is no longer still and inert, but active and alive as we gather around it. Historically, dialogue in museums has not been the norm. In many museums, it was long thought that visitors had to be brought to a single predetermined understanding of a work of art. Our curators defined that understanding, and there was widespread belief in the institutional voice. Single, one-way interpretive monologues from on high were solidified through publications, curatorial authority, exhibitions, teacher training, labels, wall text, audio guides, all with an emphasis on getting the facts right. Museum educators were then charged with transmitting these curatorial texts to passive museum visitors, often in short sound bites on highlights tours. This practice is what Brazilian philosopher and social justice activist Paulo Freire derisively called the banking system of education, in which we become, to borrow artist Sally Smart's words, in which we become pedagogical puppets who open the heads of our students and deposit information, then close the heads of the students so the information stays put. He went further, saying that when this happens, there is no room for imagination, no room for creation, participation, realization. We erase the very capacity to interact with and change the world. Museum educators themselves often prefer the direct deposit, knowing they can this way control the outcome, and fearing that in free-spirited openness, objects could start to mean anything, or that they themselves would not know enough to contain infinite possibilities in a plausible realm. Sometime in the mid-20th century, we began to acknowledge that our visitors have a great deal to say about works of art. And what they have to say is not only pretty interesting, but important and contributory to our knowledge of our works of art. So our ideal teaching practice has been shifting from the lecture to the dialogue, from the mere recitation of curatorial interpretations to including everyone in the active and ongoing interpretation of the artworks. In this newfound inclusivity, everyone is brought together to form an interpretive community, collectively realizing that the world can be a richer, deeper, and more enlightened place when we see and think together. We create, for the works of art in our museums, new texts, new meanings. We generate new ideas. Artworks thrive in the laboratories of our minds. Years ago, when I was a young, just starting out museum educator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I was teaching school groups almost every day, sometimes 2 school groups a day. And as a department for school visits, we had set certain objectives for our school visits. We wanted our students to have fun, and we wanted them to come back. We also, idealistically, wanted them to see everything. It took years to realize these were pretty low goals. Wonderful if they should have fun, but there were great works to see and to understand. And wonderful if they wanted to come back, but wasn't that a deferred responsibility, like snapping a photo of the Mona Lisa on your iPhone and saying, "I'll look at it when I get home"? And marching them from gallery to gallery to gallery to gallery did not yield inspiration, only tired feet. We finally realized we had to do better. I think in hindsight, the kids knew it too. I remember I had a friend at the time who had 3 young children, and each of them had been on a field trip to the Metropolitan Museum. And she told me this story that, thinking she should encourage their interest in art, she, one Sunday morning, asked them, or maybe threatened them, she said, "What do you want to do today? Go to church or go to the museum?" And they all said, "Church." Had we listened, we might have realized sooner that our work as museum educators must have higher goals. If, after all, museums as institutions are repositories of our culture, our heritage, our civilization, our hopes and dreams and imaginations, it is there that we as museum educators must align ourselves. In our efforts to reframe our goals, the book that Michelle mentioned, Teaching in the Art Museum, my co-author Elliot Kaiki and I began observing ourselves and our colleagues with groups in the galleries of the Getty and of the Metropolitan, and as you see in this photo, of the Frick collection. We noted visitors were most captivated by works of art through intense looking and shared thinking. When they studied a work of art with us for an hour or thereabouts, often they would say, "I never knew how to visit a museum before, that I could look at something for so long and find it more and more interesting. I never knew art could be so powerful, so beautiful, so moving. I wish I could look at everything in the museum in this way. Now I know how." We realized that when we invite people into the very process of interpretation, they will leave the museum knowing in their hearts what it is to really look at a work of art. John Dewey, the 20th century American philosopher and author of the 1934 book, Art as Experience, became our guide. He helped us understand what was happening when we were in dialogue with groups and the intensity we shared. He helped us locate ourselves in a larger enterprise that he described as an experience. And he italicized the word an, and he put quotation marks around it as well. So an experience became separate and distinct from everyday experience. So everyday experience in his mind was a continuum that all of us, for example, woke up at some point this morning, perhaps had a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, sent somebody an email, received a text, thought about the laundry we had to do over the weekend, reminded ourselves to get to the conference on time, thought a little bit about what we might be doing this evening. That's the continuum of everyday experience. But Dewey said that an experience was distinct and separate, something that was memorable, something that you would never forget, something that can happen when you look at a great work of art. So for us, an experience happens when you're pulled into the work of art and time seems to stop. When you are fully and completely absorbed, when there is nothing else in the world besides you and that work of art. It is dialogue that sets this process in motion. As we experience, we interpret, and as we interpret, we experience. We search for meaning that opens up within us. Genuine dialogues, by necessity, must be conducted in a spirit of freedom in which we honor what everyone brings to the artwork. As educators, we create the conditions for experience. We let a work of art settle down so we can begin to see in. We stop lecturing, we stop asking questions. We encourage curiosity. We privilege talking to and with the art, and to and with each other. The museum visitor is no longer spectator, but participant. The educator is no longer the driver of the experience, but part of it. The artwork is no longer still and inert, but active and alive as we gather around it and as we come alive. You have seen, I believe, in the faces of the museum visitors I have shown you, absorbed, probing, thinking, seeing, chatting, what we would now call an experience. We must have dialogue for the works of art to come alive. We must have dialogue to generate thought and imagination, to generate new texts and sometimes words bordering on poetry. By crossing into paintings through dialogue, by interpreting them together, new and beautiful worlds open to us. Although this is just a slide, and we all gather in this beautiful museum today because we love the real works of art, I'm going to ask you to suspend your disbelief that this is a slide. And if you would very kindly indulge me, I'd like you to stand up so that, in effect, you could join the students who have gathered around this great Rembrandt self-portrait. And you can stretch a bit if you want. And I'd like you to take a look into the painting, as it were, joining these students. And to be in the galleries of the Frick collection for a little bit with me. And to take a moment in silence to have your own thoughts. And when you're ready, you can take your seat again, or you can remain standing. And I'm going to now invite you to listen in to a conversation that happened around this painting after about 45 minutes of one collective conversation when I asked at the end for the students to share their last thoughts with each other.
I did find myself wondering, like, if he painted this for himself or if he painted it with the intention of someone buying it.
A tired face.
Yeah.
His expression sort of shifted, and I find if I look into his eyes for a little bit, particularly if I focus on the wrinkles underneath.
I love that it isn't a scar and that it's paint. I never would have guessed that.
Do you
Or
think
we
he,
don't know.
Right. Do you think he
Yeah.
purposely made it red so you could think it might be a
I
scar?
wonder if there's like a little, to me there seems like a little bit of humor in this painting. Like he's getting,
Like, he's kind of an old man. Like, you know, I could see, like, this is the kind of thing you paint when you think, you know, I'm starting to feel like my body's giving up on me.
Remember I think Aaron said something to the effect of, it looks like we just like caught him for just a moment. Like he just like came in and then went out really
I can't
quickly.
say it in this tone of voice, but his jowls are amazing. You really do feel that he's sitting there looking at you, maybe a little bit judgmentally.
a little bit. He probably doesn't need other people to tell him how great he is, but it doesn't hurt. You know what I mean?
Or like we interrupted him and he's sort of peering out from the darkness to acknowledge our petty presence and then go back to his little kingdom.
Yeah.
The cloak is over the chair.
Yeah, it
which
seems
is very
like it's
strange,
draped. Yeah.
Right? And there's almost no distinction between some parts of his cloak and the background.
Yeah, he fades right in, and like the location he's in is completely immaterial, and he just like, it's almost like he felt like he had to put in a little bit of the chair
Right.
under his left hand, just so like I'm sitting on something, but don't worry about it.
Yeah, I really don't know what to make of the background. It does seem like it kind of blends into him a little bit, but also it does seem separate, like in a way. I don't know.
Yeah.
I do think people had self-portraits of like famous people
Really? Okay.
in their homes.
That could be.
It's like how we put up posters in our rooms, you know, like
It's true.
maybe.
He almost looks like matronly in this photo. Like, I don't know, sort of like how much was known about Rembrandt.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was like, that's what I was saying. I was like saying
In
to my
terms
brother,
of
like, is he
blurring
feminine? Yeah.
lines of gender identities.
Yeah.
But it's amazing.
But
I agree with that. I think in fact, the way that he's cinched his gold
yeah, I was like, is that's
under
really
his
impressive.
yeah, absolutely. It looks much more like an ample bosom than it does anything else.
Right.
I do like the contrast between his two hands, like she was talking about. That one is so
Yeah.
precise, and that one is so not.
It fits the idea that the left hand is only a support for the right
It
hand.
makes you wish like you could crank up the brightness a little bit and see
Right.
what's behind it.
It's so strange that he chose it to be so dark.
What do you think about the signature that's hard to make out?
I feel like it's one of those things where like he doesn't need to sign it because we all know.
No, but just to make sure.
Yeah, just in case like you really didn't know, like you're some like neophyte or something.
Right hand looks like the model hands that they use in like surgery or anatomy.
Yeah, I know. I
That's
was
what I think
actually
of.
thinking, like, his hand almost looks like like it just looks very distinguished.
Yes. You got the flexor digitorum.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And so the extensor
He just threw
digitorum.
the fur cape.
Right. No. Right. I totally think that like he just threw these things on.
And,
for, like,
and that's like what lets us like threw the hat out, and he can like quickly get out of this and go back to it.
Interesting. So at first glance, this is very serious, regal, masculine, I would say, pose. And then if you look closer, it's almost like he's inviting you to share in his playfulness.
I don't know. I love that color. It's like really like a rich gold.
So you might ask, how did this rich conversation come about? As I said before, this was after about 45 minutes in that this occurred, and I wanted to show you that we started in silence. And during this silence, we took possession of the painting, as I asked you to do of the slide, occupying the painting, as it were, with our own thoughts. And as we began to talk together, we were pulled into the artwork with observations, questions, ruminations, thoughts that arose in any order. I briefly summarized some of what was said in this conversation because I'm going to replay what you just saw, and you will hear that the students keep returning to things that they were noticing or things that they were puzzled by. The first comment was by Natasha, who said, "He has such an enigmatic expression. It is unclear what his emotions are." And Will, sitting in the front, said, "He did not make himself pretty. We see his jowls, his age, his puckered skin." Joanna said, "My eye goes so quickly to his gaze. He sees with such power. It's an artist's gaze." And Aaron said, "Shadow covers his eyes, but we're drawn to them. We sense that we can't fully see them, but they can see us. Curiously, the powerful sight is not reciprocal. By using a flickering shadow over the eyes, the place you want to see most is both hidden and revealed." Jonathan said, "The brushwork is so vivid. You can see his extraordinary relationship to paint and to color." Petrus said, "How can his hands be so big and so graceful at the same time? My focus is now shifting back between his hands and his eyes." And Emily said, "There's a sense of honesty. It's the visible age, the scar, it's the intense background." And the conversation continued. It's as if he highlights his hands and eyes because together they are his work, his life. Rembrandt says, "I see with my eyes, I paint with my hands." The pose is regal. It's a king's pose. There's a heaviness of thought, a display of technical skill, as if it's as much a self-portrait of art as it is a portrait of himself. There are sumptuous fabrics, yet in some places they're only suggestive. In some places there are rich details. Rembrandt wraps himself in darkness. It's a philosophical darkness. Perhaps he is wondering just how much light he has left. As the educator, I quietly added how Rembrandt concerned himself with the interweaving of divine and human form when your life is interrogated by both heaven and earth, by light and dark. A student says, "But how triumphant Rembrandt is, even in his old age. It was at this point that I asked the group to break into the small, private conversations you just heard. So, what were the conditions for looking, thinking, and possibly having an experience with this painting? We decided to explore just one work of art. We allowed for silence as well as for talking. We understood that freedom had to be a precondition to allow ideas to move in and to emerge in any order. We understand that every idea is welcome and that we truly believe in the value of what everyone has to say. That the educator stops asking questions, but instead follows the observations and inquiries of the students. We understand there is no there, no grand message or conclusion at the end. Each student will come to his or her own understanding or resting place of interpretation. In this way, we create the conditions for an experience without predetermining what that experience will be. I wanted to repeat that. These are the words of Maxine Green. We create the conditions for an experience without predetermining what that experience will be. These are acts of interpretation that are transacted in a spirit of freedom and trust. What we did not do was preempt these intensely personal responses with a traditional authoritative from on high voice. In too many museums, it would have sounded something like this. Rembrandt painted this great self-portrait in 1658 when he was living and working in Amsterdam. He was 52 years old, and although he had experienced great financial difficulties, his reputation was widespread in Europe. Exploring the dynamics between light and shadow, Rembrandt was a master not only of painting, but of printmaking and drawing, and ran a considerably large and prestigious workshop. And so on, and thank you for laughing, and so on until the painting almost dies on the wall before you. If John Dewey had heard this, John Dewey would be tough. He would say that the barrage of information that I just read would have precluded any possibility for an experience. Paulo Freire would be even tougher, telling us that we had once again become pedagogical puppets, using the head-opening banking system, marginalizing our students, oppressing them, abandoning them. Paulo Freire said, we cannot take away their agency by telling them what to see and what to think. And I would like to add 2 notes of my own. First, a note about questions. And many of my colleagues in museum education very much disagree with what I'm about to say. But to my mind, equally oppressive as the single authoritative voice is the tyranny of asking questions in the museum. And I'm not talking about the classroom, I'm talking about the museum. Some museum educators, in order to avoid the lecture mode and to engage visitors, have resorted to the use of asking questions, lots of questions. I have seldom heard in gallery teaching a question I liked. Often they are riddles or right-wrong questions. For example, a former curatorial colleague at the Frick, thinking he should be more visitor-friendly, asked his group when looking at a Vermeer painting what might be written on a little slip of paper that was in the picture, and a participant laughingly joked, maybe it's a laundry list, and he snapped, no, that's not one of the options. That's extreme. But my colleagues tell me open-ended questions are good questions, but again, I've seldom heard a so-called open question that I liked. An example of a so-called open-ended question, what makes Goya modern, is hardly open-ended when there are indeed many possibilities, but in the questioner's mind, there is just one answer. And I took note, as perhaps some of you did, in the video for the National Arts curriculum that was shown yesterday, 2 days ago, yesterday, there was a moment where the narrator was asking the children to show their books. And the children were so interested to show their drawings and to talk a little bit about their stories. And then suddenly the narrator switched into questions and said, "How do you think people feel when they hear your stories?" And you could see each of the children flinch. There was just that one moment, and then they bravely rose to the occasion and came up with an answer. But some thread of trust had been broken, and it was, for me, painful to see. So either there are too many questions, making it an interrogation, or there are always the instructor's questions, making it a kind of cross-examination. And finally, it is often unclear to our public why we are asking questions in the museum at all. My niece Emma went on her first school visit, this was some years ago, to a great museum in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And I asked her to call me when she came back from her school visit to the museum to tell me how she liked it. And so she called me and she said, "Hi, Aunt Rika." And I said, "How did it go?" And she said, "Oh, it was really beautiful. But Aunt Rika, why did they ask us so many questions?" She said, "Don't the people who work there know anything?" She said, if they knew about the art, why would they be asking us? And so I've come to a stance where I believe the questions should come from the visitors and not from the museum educators, so that they, not we, can ask the questions that they need to know, the questions that will open up new worlds for them, and the most profound questions unimaginable to us. A second note, and this was a hard one for me. It was.
I did find myself wondering, like.
Sorry. I hit something. Can I go back? Okay, good. A second note, and this was a very hard one for me in my own practice, and it was about giving up grand conclusions at the end of teaching. It was hard for me to give up a summarizing statement, one that preempts the experience that has just transpired. I used to have a favorite concluding statement that was written by Simon Schama about the great Rembrandt self-portrait in the Frick. And he wrote, "Instead of being diminished by his misfortunes, Rembrandt seems to have become augmented by them, visibly expanding before our eyes like a genie, pressing hard against the perimeter of the picture space as though challenging it to contain the force of his authority." A beautiful statement, but it wasn't the words of the people who had just participated in their own creation of text for that painting. And I think, again, the students understood that before I did. A couple years ago, after an experience of talking about the Rembrandt self-portrait, a student sent me an email. And she said, "It felt as if we kept getting closer to the center, only to be drawn back out again. And once we finally got to the center, there was no flashing sign, no treasure map, not even a hint." I think she was clearly having an experience because she kept thinking about it, and 2 days later sent me a second email. She said, "Although this experience with Rembrandt was frustrating at times, I learned to relish it. After we had spent so much time trying to decipher or shed some light on the meaning, it seemed as if this slightly lost, questing feeling was exactly what the thoughtful viewer was meant to take away." So, with all this said, I'd like to ask you to listen in a second time to the conversation that happened at the end of a 45-minute conversation, thinking as what you're listening to now as a new text, a new label, a new audio guide, so to speak, for understanding this extraordinary painting, but a new text that will be replaced by the next conversation the next day, which will be replaced by the next conversation the next day after that.
I did find myself wondering, like, if he painted this for himself or if he painted it with the intention of someone buying it.
A tired face.
Yeah.
His expression sort of shifted, and I find if I look into his eyes for a little bit, particularly if I focus on the wrinkles underneath.
I love that it isn't a scar and that it's paint. I never would have guessed that.
Do you
Or
think
we
he,
don't know.
right? Do you think he
Yeah.
purposely made it red so you could think it might be a scar?
I wonder if there's like a little, to me there seems like a little bit of humor in this painting. Like he's getting,
Like he's kind of an old man. Like, you know, I could see like this is the kind of thing you paint when you think, you know, I'm starting to feel like my body's giving up.
Remember I think Aaron said something to the effect of, it looks like we just like caught him for just a moment. Like he just like came in and then went out
I
really
can't
quickly.
say it in this tone of voice, but his jowls are amazing. You really do feel that he's sitting there looking at you maybe a little bit judgmentally.
a little bit. He probably doesn't need other people to tell him how great he is, but it doesn't hurt. You know what I mean?
Or like we interrupted him and he's sort of peering out from the darkness to acknowledge our petty presence and then go back to his little kingdom.
Yeah.
The cloak is over the chair.
Yeah, it
which
seems
is very
like it's
strange,
draped. Yeah.
right? And there's almost no distinction between some parts of his cloak and the background.
Yeah, he fades right in, and like the location he's in is completely immaterial, and he just like, it's almost like he felt like he had to put in a little bit of the chair
Right.
under his left hand, just so like I'm sitting on something, but don't worry about it.
Yeah, I really don't know what to make of the background. It does seem like it kind of blends into him a little bit, but also it does seem separate, like in a way. I don't know.
I do think people had self-portraits of like famous people
Really? Okay.
in their homes.
That could
It's
be.
like how we put up posters in our rooms, you know, like
It's true.
maybe.
He almost looks like matronly in this photo. Like, I don't know, sort of like how much was known about
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying. I was like saying
In
to my
terms
brother,
of
like, is he
blurring
feminine there? Yeah.
lines of gender identities.
Yeah.
But amazing.
But
I agree with that. I think in fact, the way that he's cinched his gold
Yeah, I was like, is that
under
really
his,
your breast?
I mean, that's right, yeah, absolutely. It looks much more like an ample bosom than it does
Right,
anything else.
right.
I do like the contrast between his two hands. Like she was talking about, that one is so
Yeah.
precise and that one is so not.
It fits the idea that the left hand is only a support for the right
It
hand.
makes you wish like you could crank up the brightness a little bit and see
Right.
what's behind it.
It's so strange that he chose it to be so dark.
What do you think about the signature that's hard to make out?
I feel like it's one of those things where like he doesn't need to sign it because we all know.
Oh, really? But just to make sure.
Yeah, just in case like you really didn't know, like you're some like neophyte or something.
Right hand looks like the model hands that they use in like surgery or anatomy.
Yeah, I know.
That's
I was
what I think
actually
of.
thinking, like, his hand almost looks like a distinct, like it just looks very distinguished.
Yes. You got the flexor digitorum.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
That's why the extensor
He just
digitorum.
threw the fur cape.
Right. No. Right. I totally think that like he just threw these things on.
And,
for, like,
and that's like what's his like, threw the hat out, and he can like quickly get out of this and go back to it.
Interesting. At first glance, this is very serious, regal, masculine, I would say, pose. And then if you look closer, it's almost like he's inviting you to share in his playfulness.
I don't know. I love that color. It's like really like a rich gold.
So we'll let Rembrandt end there. And I would now like to turn to a great masterpiece in the collection of this museum. Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles, about which I have a bit of a personal history, a personal story. I didn't see it when it was painted in 1952, and I didn't see it when it left New York in 1974, lowered out of the window of Ben Heller's apartment, and practically blown up Central Park West, as I presume it was loaded onto a truck at the beginning of its journey to take up residence here. But I did see it when it made a visit back to New York in 1998 into the beginning of 1999 at a fabulous Jackson Pollock retrospective at MoMA. I know that many people, and I think all the museum educators here can attest to this, many people are very suspicious of Jackson Pollock And we had people talking about their questioning whether a child could do this, whether it was really art. But I myself have always loved these beautiful, almost euphoric, cosmic works of his until I saw this one. And when I first saw it at MoMA, I just hated it. And I thought, how is it possible? Has Jackson Pollock lost his mind? Didn't he know that he was into this beautiful cosmos of swirling infinity? And how could he interrupt it with these slashing, gashing poles of paint, as it were? But something about it asked me to come back again and again, and I did. And then suddenly, I was in love. Without having any cognitive understanding, without having any words to explain my transformation, I was suddenly in love. And I thought it was the most beautiful painting in the world. And when I left New York to come back, excuse me, here, I thought my heart would break. So imagine my pleasure to reunite with this great painting this week. But thinking about it and this chance to reunite came together with my thinking lately that there are paintings that are best experienced through the back and the behind, that is, without words, without dialogue. Paintings you just want to somehow possess in your soul. Probably each one of us has a painting like this tucked away somewhere in this museum or another museum, at home or in your mind's eye, a painting that you feel you understand somehow in your soul, but not in your logical, cognitive mind. And Blue Poles is one for me. The idea of not talking in a structured museum education gallery program has, of course, implications for a museum education practice where we traffic in lectures and tours, and I hope many conversations. But I think now perhaps we need to learn to honor the silence of artworks as well. Kirk Varnadoe, who was one of the curators at MoMA during this great retrospective, wrote passionately and profusely about Pollock and came to this conclusion at the end. He said, "A lot has been written and continues to be written about Jackson Pollock's pictures that just embodies the common cultural clutter of the time. The paintings do not. To be reminded of them, to be reminded of this, please just look at them." So I'd like you now to take a deep look into Blue Poles, and you should each have a piece of white paper that you were given when you came in. So if you could put down anything that's on your lap, except for the white paper. I'd like you, once again, to stand up, holding the white paper. And if you could just hold it quietly like this. And you can start at either the right or the left or the middle, but I would like you to tilt with each of the poles until you've tilted with all the poles. So shift from one foot to the other. And then slowly come to an end of your tilting. And take your paper up and just line the edges up with the various blue poles so that you're partially revealing, partially concealing parts of the painting. And then very gently take your paper and fold it carefully into a loose tube. So it's like this, not too tight. And take a look. And then put the tube over your mouth and just blow or hum at the painting. And then take your tube and gently unroll it. And very slowly crumple the paper. And just feel the paper in your hands for a moment. And then take a seat. And put the paper on your lap. And very carefully and gently open it. And now take it and carefully give it a fold for each of the poles. And when you're finished, just hold it up. And wave it around a little bit. And take it down. And if you haven't opened it, open it. And without saying anything, just show it to the person next to you. And then take it back, and I'd like to ask you to sit on it. Thank you. So what I propose that we just did is an act of interpretation that can occur without words. In such acts that are close in nature to performative arts or performative events, we create pathways that take us in through the back, the behind, the dark side of the artwork, where the artwork whispers and cajoles and insists and then disappears. As educators, we must think about giving visitors and ourselves the option of wordless, immersive, participatory experiences, the option not to say anything. Slashing worlds and crumpled papers are what one might call sovereign accidents that urge us to be disobedient. to resist logic, to move away from content narrowly defined. In our paper action, we are awakened into an intense awareness of Pollock's world. We make the flat world of his canvas our playing field, creating an active realm, a potent space in which we exist with and in the object, powerfully and with agency. I believe that this constitutes a new opening for museum education in the 21st century. We might say that the dialogical act that we spoke about with Rembrandt, that is, experience and interpretation transacted in words, is a logical enterprise, one that creates a distance between us and the object so that we can move into the artwork slowly, even cautiously. When we ask for engagement, as I just did, that is without words, beyond words, there is no space between us and the work of art. We move in recklessly. We adhere to the object in some inexplicable way. Through such acts of interpretation, the space is charged. We are immersed. We emerge changed. Our action feels like a kind of magic, if you will, that enables us to merge in mind, in heart, and in imagination with the work of art. By way of conclusion, I go back to our visitors. Works of art live because we interpret them. They invite our contemplation. We enable focused, looking, and sustained engagement to make possible deep and affective experience. Time, absorption, reverie, imagination, knowledge are all on the increase. These are the conditions in which the objects disclose themselves. This in turn makes possible transformation, acts of interpretation, and even joy. And we'll end there. Thank you so much.